Assalamu alaikum. Our next speaker is Sidi Sarfraz Wali, and he's a speaker and researcher on Islamic economics and flaws of capitalism. Co-author of the best paper at the Sharia Economic Conference in 2013 in Hanover, Economic Growth Imperative Within Capitalism and the Islamic Alternative. And he's debated and been involved in roundtable discussions with Professor Keith Pilbeam, Head of Economic Cass Business School at the University of London, and David Smith, Financial Editor of the Sunday Times. With this paper, you will get the link to his blog. There's quite a lot of interesting material there. What he's going to address today, what would be the title of your talk today?
If you turn that piece of paper over,
sure.
The title
is Evolution of Capitalist Economic Thought, Feudal System to Present. So you've seen there's been quite a spread of topics within the module. We've approached it from a philosophical perspective, from a classical Islamic perspective, from the Medina of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We've seen the study of the Awqaf today and your history, Sidi Amar's history of usury among the Jews and the Christians. And it's quite important, this is a very significant, important topic now, is that we at least have some familiarity with the dominant schools of economic thought in Western history. And we're very grateful to Sidi Sarfraz for coming today to do that. So without further ado, I'll hand the chair over to you. Cool.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. As the brother said, what I intend to do here is just to cover the history, if you like, not so much recent history, but last, say, 1500 years or so, of how capitalist economic thought has evolved through various stages, so that we can better understand the current discourse which is going on in terms of the solutions which are being presented to the crisis which has happened since post-2008, especially where people who are not economists have now started to get more interested in following, understanding what's happened within the banking sector and how that's affected them in terms of taxation and job security and all of the negative things that we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. And I think it's very useful to bring in the historical perspective so that we can better understand where we are now, for a number of reasons. One of which is, as Muslim dawah carriers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated us to demonstrate the supremacy of the Islamic solutions. And I find it's very difficult to do that in the sphere of economics, dawah in the sphere of economics, without being familiar with the history of capitalism, because otherwise you're entering a debate which has got certain terminology, certain jargon, certain idiosyncrasies, and if you're not really familiar with those differences and those arguments and where those arguments came from historically, I don't think you're going to be very effective in moving that debate forward and actually moving it towards a more Islamic orientated solution. So that's like the broader context. Otherwise, I could have just come here as a pure secular, with a secular cap and said, look, this is Keynesianism, this is monetarism. But we need to mention it in that context, otherwise it becomes very academic discussion. So what I was going to do, as I said, is I was going to touch on the predominant schools of thought, starting from around about for the last 1,000 years or so. And I carved them into 7 predominant turning points. Because obviously there will be small variation along the way, which I've generally not touched on so much. It's the key, the big milestones, the big turning points, which are where there's a paradigm shift, if you like, from that which preceded. And so if I were to rank them, and again, if you don't want to take notes, this will all be up on my blog, which I will circulate the link afterwards. So I will upload this onto my blog today or tomorrow. So the key turning points are, number one, the feudal system. Secondly, the period of mercantilism. Thirdly, the physiocrats. Fourthly, the classical school. Fifthly, the neoclassical school. Sixthly, the Keynesian school. And finally, the monetarist school. And there were certain variations which sprang from there, but let's just group it under generally monetarism / rational expectations school. Then after I've gone through that discussion, and the way the discussion will proceed is I will analyze each of these according to 4 criteria, or 4 angles. Number one is the timeline, when these school of thought came, what period in history they were associated with. Secondly, the context within which that school arose. What was the background, what was the situation at the time. Thirdly, the contributors, who were the people associated with this school or this thinking or this change. Fourthly, the key assumptions that this school or way of thinking relied upon in order to formulate their opinions and their conclusions. And fifthly, are the policy recommendations, because without the policy recommendations, it's a bit abstract to say this school of thought believed in, such and such, without saying how does that belief manifest itself in terms of a policy, a governmental policy or a central bank policy or some kind of institutional policy. So I will use these 5, if you like, areas to analyze each of these major schools. And I will try to proceed very quickly to give you just a feel. And then obviously if there's certain areas where people want to go into more detail, they can either raise it in the Q&A or send a question into the blog, and I will endeavour to answer those questions in more detail. The minor sort of schools / turning points I'll also touch on. And again, like I said, they're not really paradigm shifts from these 7 types. They're more like variations or adjustments or amendments. Number one is behavioral economics. Number 2 is the new and the post-Keynesian school / new neoclassical school. Thirdly is the Austrian school, which I'm sure, being quite into the gold standard, many of you may have heard of the Austrian school. Again, not a real paradigm shift from, monetarism, but just a variant which is worth discussing briefly. Reaganomics, which came in obviously with the induction of Ronald Reagan. Neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. And finally, a return to Keynesianism post-2008. So these are some variants which are sort of like worth touching on just to bring the debate up to the modern context. If we start with feudalism, the timeline for feudalism was approximately the 11th century. So from the reign of King William I, or William the Conqueror as he's also known as, around about the Battle of Hastings when he came from Normandy. The Viking king from Normandy came, defeated Harold, and brought more or less the system dates back to that point. So that's the timeline, and it lasted until approximately the 15th century, around about the Reformation, when people like Oliver Cromwell started to attack the absolute monarchies of the time and create what are today constitutional monarchies, with the whole notion of religion and organized church, and with the bringing about of the printing press and the translation of the Bible into languages people could understand, started to undermine the absolute supremacy of the church. That's when feudalism started to become unraveled. So we're talking about 400 or 500 years that this particular system lasted. What was the context? So feudalism, as I said, arose during the Middle Ages due to arrangement between landowners who offered protection to lower servants in exchange for working the land. So there was a a hierarchy within society. And this hierarchy was supported by the church's absolute autonomy and supremacy, and draconian understanding of religion and people's position in society. So this structure was generally characterized with the kings at the top, moving through the lords, the nobles, and then there were knights, and then there were finally merchants and peasants at the bottom. So this was like a symbiotic sort of mutual arrangement where peasants were told, you are poor, God ordained you to be poor, you just have to work the land for protection. So this patronage culture, which predated, from Roman times, was something that was quite status quo at the time. It was not like unusual for people to live in this type of patronage to landowners and just work the land and then provide military services to, the knights who would then protect the nobles who would serve the king. So this system was very much a control for the clergy-based system. So what policy recommendations? Now, one thing I'd say before I start talking about policy recommendations, within economics, there's a notion of micro and macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is more to do with the national picture. So policymakers, when they're talking about macroeconomics, they're talking about deciding, what the interest rate should be, what is an acceptable level of unemployment, what should inflation be targeted to, what should we do with our balance of payments, with our trade, what about our currency? These are global macro variables. Microeconomics deals more with localized, what should the price of this product be, or what wage should I set for this type of worker? These are very much macro variables. So a lot of these schools are actually giving recommendations at the macro level. So, and feudalism was not really something which really had much to say at the macroeconomic level. It was very much regional, the king and, his clergy and the knights and barons, and, they would basically control a certain area of land, and that was it. That was their domain. So there was no concept of, globally we should have, this type of a tax regime. It was very much regionalized system. So not much to say on the feudalism front when it comes to policy. Then along the next sort of turning point was mercantilism. Now, the backdrop to the rise of mercantilism was obviously, as I mentioned, the Reformation was happening. Church's authority was starting to become unravelled. People like Oliver Cromwell in the UK and Jean-Baptiste Colbert in France were starting to challenge the authority of absolute monarchical rule. Obviously, in this country, we have a constitutional monarchy, but there was a long time where there were absolute monarchies, where the kings were ruling on behalf of it was said what is they were like the vicegerents of God on earth. Whatever they said was divine decree. So, and people had no knowledge to question this. So they were living in servitude to the system. When that started to get challenged, people started to understand, what the Bible really meant, what it taught. They started to become discontentment with this type of scenario. The famous English Civil War, which happened during Cromwell's reign in the 1640s, I think, was a long, bloody struggle between the Parliament and the monarchy. And then what settled as an aftermath of that struggle was really the end of the absolute power of monarchies and the birth of mercantilism, which was basically a system which was based on the nation-state trading with other nations. So now it's like a parliament is established. You've got a move towards a more democratic form of government, where the nation would try to establish colonies. So colonialism is very intertwined with this new phase of capitalism, i.e. the idea that you go and you seek colonies all over the world. You expatriate the resources to the mother country, and you become affluent off the back of your colonies, and you trade with your colonies. You don't allow your colonies to become self-sufficient. You use them as consumer markets, like Britain was using America, to ship raw materials and then sell back finished goods, and prohibiting laws that prevented the Americans from, establishing their own industries. So obviously there's only so long that a system like that can last, and they will start to become rebellion. But that was the context of mercantilism stroke colonialism, which we're talking about the 1600s to the late 18th century. So what were the key assumptions of mercantilism? The key assumption, and this is important to really then appreciate how the classical school diverted from this particular phase in history. The key assumption of the mercantile school was that trade and commerce was a zero-sum game, i.e., I can only gain by making you lose. Your loss is my gain, and my gain can only happen as a result of your loss. So if that was the psyche and understanding towards economics and trade, commerce, then obviously every nation was trying to maximize its exports and minimize its imports so that it could amass gold and silver. Mercantilism was based on trying to bring as much gold and silver back to your country as possible, and to minimize the imports, maximize the exports, and that obviously would explain a lot of the view of the colonies within Africa, for example, and elsewhere, where everything was looked at as we need to get raw materials very, very cheaply. And no regard to the rights of people. It should be borne in mind that sometimes we talk in absolutes as if everyone today understands that, but there's many studies that have been done. Jacob Weiner being one example from the Chicago Business School, who's one of the lecturers of Milton Friedman, who actually did a study in which he argued the opposite, saying that the colonies actually cost the mother country more than they extracted back. So it's just worth mentioning that even something that we accept as a given, you can bet there'll be a counter narrative somewhere. So just bear that in mind when you go out and say, when you say something which you think is very black and white. But anyway, that was the predominant way of looking at trade under the mercantile period, i.e. zero-sum gain. I can only gain by impoverishing you, so therefore I will maximize my exports, minimize my imports. And that thinking hasn't necessarily gone away in all countries. China, for example, pursues a very mercantile way when it comes to foreign trade. So it seeks to maximize its exports to primarily America and emerging countries and minimize its imports. And it does that through manipulation of its currency. Japan had that view until America stopped it under the Plaza Accord in the late 80s under James Baker, where they weren't allowed to do that anymore. But basically, these countries are pursuing a very mercantile trade policy. But anyway, the key point to remember is zero-sum gain. Zero-sum gain. I can only gain by making you lose. So what are the policy recommendations according to this particular school of thought? Basically, the policy recommendation is the government regulation of a nation's economy, driving it towards exports and minimizing imports, seeking colonies, colonizing other countries, setting up navies, strong fleets, so it can protect its colonies like the British Empire, and to amass precious metal, i.e. gold and silver. So that's really what characterized the mercantile school. Then came the physiocrats. Now the physiocrats, we're talking about the mid to the late 1700s, sort of just before the classical school of Adam Smith. Now their sort of conclusions are quite naive, and to some extent that's mitigated by the fact that they came just at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, because their argument was that a nation's strength is in its agricultural production. So that's what it should focus on. Obviously, as we know, the Industrial Revolution was from about 1750, so that's roughly, they were right at the doorstep of the Industrial Revolution, so they can be forgiven for having that view. But why they are, in my discussion, as a key turning point, is not because of the conclusion that they had, i.e. that the wealth of a nation is an agricultural production. Rather, it's in the type of scientific approach the founders of the physiocrat school started to employ in the field of economics. And that is what started to unravel this notion of trade being a zero-sum game that was advocated by the mercantile school. Now, one of the founders of the physiocrat school, Francois Quense, who lived from 1694 to 1774, was a doctor by trade. So he was quite familiar with scientific methods of analyzing, and he applied his methods to the field of economics, which is quite revolutionary. So that's why I think it's worthy to mention the physiocrats, because if it was purely on the basis of their conclusion, I would not have given that school the honor of being in this list. So certain things they would see in their day and age. So where there was a famine and governments would at the time subsidize, production to try to boost production. And they would argue, no, you should let the market deal with this because the price will be very high when the supply is very low because of a famine. And that will prompt others to start producing that commodity, and that will then drive the price down and it will force the supply up. Obviously controversial because it implies you let people die in the meantime, and that's something that Adam Smith even picked up on. But nonetheless, it started to bring in the discipline of systematic scientific thinking to economics, and that's why the physiocrat school are worthy of mention. Now the classical school. The classical school, this school, fathered by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, two of the most notable contributors to the classical school. It arose in the late 18th century, and it was quite prevalent until the early 19th century, at which point it metamorphosized into the neoclassical school. But until the neoclassical school came, it was very much a paradigm shift from everything that came before. Because after the two key publications by Adam Smith, the Theory of Moral Sentiments and then the Wealth of Nations in 1776, what he said, which was different to everything that went before, is that trade is not a zero-sum game. I keep saying game, subhanAllah. Trade is not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win. So if we come together in a free market, then everyone will improve. My improvement is not at your expense. So we will create something which is the sum will be much larger than the result will be a lot larger than the sum of the parts. So this is quite revolutionary. This is why it's not just a little iteration along the path. It's a very fundamental break from what preceded. Because he's saying everybody can become a winner. It's a win-win. And the way he believed that this win-win could be materialized is if the market is left free. The people are allowed to specialize in terms of their labor, to do what they're best, a concept called the division of labor. So if you're better at crafts and you're not very good at farming, then rather than spend time doing farming and craft work, you should just focus on the thing which gives you maximum return. And if everybody is doing this in society, then the net gain is for everybody, and the wealth of all the participants will improve. It's like the phrase, the rising tide raises all boats. So if the tide starts to rise, all the boats which are on the water will all go up. And that was the revolutionary contribution of Adam Smith. So justifying and condoning self-interest. In fact, if you read Wealth of Nations, his book, he's critical of people who want to do good. He says if everybody is only looking after their own individual interests, this will serve the collective interests more fruitfully than if everybody actually went out to try to serve the collective interest. So it's basically given a green light to individualism, seeking your own, you are an individual, seeking your own interest on the basis that it creates more affluence for society, which will then benefit everybody. So clearly a big departure from everything that had been seen before, and is considered the birth of capitalism as we know it today. So it's such a big step from what preceded it that it's really where we mark the birth of modern capitalism from. So this concept of this invisible hand, which creates wealth for all, is coined to Adam Smith. So what is the policy recommendation at the macroeconomic level from the classical school? Is the government should have a minimal role. Laissez-faire economics, this French term, hands off. The government should allow the market to self-adjust, self-correct. It should have a minimal role. Obviously, you cannot completely remove the role of the government, because there's certain things that the government has to do in a free society, such as protecting people's rights, property rights, protecting the shores from invaders. You can't let the private sector do things like that. Courts of law. So there's going to be some functions for the government. But beyond those bare-bone functions, the government should not really have a role. Because the key assumption of the classical school is that markets are very efficient. They're very efficient at regulating themselves, at coming to equilibrium. If you take a medical analogy like the human body, when it's cold, your hair stand up, your veins constrict to preserve heat. And when it becomes warm, the opposite happens. Your veins come to the surface, your hair lie flat, you start sweating. This is a homeostatic system, self-regulating system. And the classical view of economy was very much like this, that the economy will adjust quite well when left alone by the government. So what that tangibly means is when prices for something are too high, people will stop buying it, the prices will come down, and then they will become equilibrium. So if you're a businessman with a lot of stock and nobody's buying it, you will drop the price to the point where everybody will start getting interested in your stock, and then they will buy it. That would be an analogy when it comes to economics, i.e. the price. And the classical view was markets are very efficient and they work like this. So that's the classical school, 1860s to around about the 1930s. Then you had the neoclassical school. Now, the neoclassical school didn't really depart from the classical school at the macroeconomic level. So there was no fundamental paradigm shift when it came to the neoclassical school as far as the government's role in terms of, should it have more or less of a role. What the groundbreaking innovation from the neoclassical point of view was very much in the microeconomic sphere. And in particular, the whole subject of value. Because the question of value is a very confusing and contentious subject from Adam Smith's time, which was never really settled. And it's very important when it comes to commerce and trade. Because if you don't understand the value of something, how can you ascribe some kind of price and exchange ratio with something else? So, for example, if I'm a farmer and it takes me, or if I'm a carpenter and it takes me a day to produce a table, and you're a tailor and it takes you a day to sew a suit. According to the classical view of value, the time spent in the production of the thing gives it its value. So on that basis, my chair is worth your suit because it took me a day and it took you a day. And that is important because without some notion of value, you can't really trade, because otherwise somebody could say, this jacket has taken me a week to make. How long did that table take you? 1 week, 2 weeks. According to the classical view of value, it's literally the time it takes to produce that thing which gives it its value, which therefore gives it its exchange potential with something else, which we use the price today, because price is a type of exchange. All it is rather than a barter system where you trade one good for another, you trade a good with money, and that's the price. So the neoclassical school really refined this whole concept of value, and they developed a theory which has become used to the modern day. And it's a theory which is called the theory of marginal utility. And to give a quick explanation of that without going into too much detail, if you met somebody in the desert and they were about to die, and you walked up to them with a glass of water, and said, how much will you pay for this glass of water? That person would say, I'll give you all my possessions. Just give me the glass of water. So if you walked away and you converted his possessions into some monetary unit and you found that's £1 million, only a fool would then start to sell glasses of water in society for £1 million, because that person's demand at that point was not at his weakest need, it was at his most intense need, and it's a point of desperation. In fact, even Islam has certain rules about, don't put somebody in the point and exploit their desperation. But that aside, rather, if I were to take the analogy of a pen, again, if somebody was in a situation where they needed to sign a contract and they were going to benefit vastly from that contract and they didn't have a piece of paper and they had 10 seconds left, they'd pay millions for this pen. But they wouldn't pay millions in a normal situation. So what is the correct view of value, according to the marginal school, is the way you look at the utility of this at the weakest point of need, not at the strongest point of need. So if you were, for example, consuming something like a sip of Coke or a glass, and you're very thirsty, the utility you get on the first sip is very high. As you take subsequent sips, the utility starts to go down to the point where the utility approaches zero. But just before that point, it's the point of weakest need. That's the basis upon which you measure utility of everything. And that's the basis upon which you compare the utility of different things. So this is the contribution made by the neoclassical school. And obviously it puts a different perspective to the classical view when it comes to things like wages and the value of work and so on. So it did really help this whole subject of pricing in terms of the microeconomic sphere. Some of the key contributors were and there were contributors that came from various countries in Europe, and they formulated this view quite independently, but they were at the same sort of time. William Jevons in Britain, 1835 to 1882. Karl Menger, Austria, who later on went to form the Austrian school, 1840 to 1921. Leon Walras, I think he was from France or Poland, I can't remember, but he was another big name in the neoclassical revolution, 1834 to 1910. And later on in the second wave, Alfred Marshall, 1842 to 1924. So that was the neoclassical school. So policy-wise, again, nothing really changing at the macroeconomic level, but at the microeconomic level, it gave a different perspective on how to view the value of things and what the price of things should be. Because prior to that point, and Marx picked up on this when he talked about the concept of surplus value, is the capitalist will extract labor from the worker and pay him a pittance relative to what the capitalist gets when he sells his products. And the difference between the value contributed by the worker and the price that the capitalist retrieves for his production is all exploitation. Marx actually used the classical view of value, which is that the value comes from the labor. Because he used it because it was expedient for him to use that, because it really justified his premise that the labor is provided, the value is all provided by the worker, and the worker gets a pittance, yet the capitalist gets all the revenue from the sale. So that's a huge degree of exploitation. But obviously, that view of value was superseded by the neoclassicals, as I mentioned. The next key turning point was the Keynesian school. Now, the Keynesian school, after John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946, was the context, his school, the Keynesian view was very strong from about the 1930s during the Great Depression until the 1970s, when everything predicted by Keynes, modelled by Keynes, started to fall apart, when we had stagflation. So that's about a 40-year period where Keynesianism ruled supreme. So the background, like I mentioned, to the Keynesian school was the Great Depression of the 1930s, which started in America after the 1929 Wall Street crash, and it led to the longest drawn-out Great Depression, a global Great Depression that the modern world has ever seen. And the old classical prescription for that was let the market self-adjust, let the market self-correct. And that just wasn't happening. So years went by and the market wasn't correcting. And if you think about it, it's really a paper recession, because it's not as if you had a war which decimated the country's productive capability. It's not as if there were famine which burned, all the factories, or, there was a plague and all the productive workers were destroyed, or, any such natural disaster which would break a country's productive capability. The factors of production were not affected by this. It was literally a stock market crash. And then various problems happened, part of which was the insufficiency of the money supply in the aftermath of the stock market crash. Just to give you some stats, the money supply went down by a third from 1929 to 1933. And as you know, when there's insufficient money in relation to the requirements of trade, unless you can deflate the prices of things, you have a recession. So government policy exacerbated the recession. So anyway, things were not improving according to the classical remedy. So Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, I think the name was, in 1936. And it was, again, another groundbreaking paradigm shift. Because what he said is, the assumptions of the classical school, where markets are adjust, where markets self-correct, it doesn't really happen in reality. Because prices are quite sticky. They are quite resistant to change. Prices tend not to adjust. That was one of the key assumptions of the Keynesian view. So therefore, because, and to give an example of this, if you're in a business, it's not always easy to drop down your prices, because that's what was needed in the 1930s to bring the economy back onto the track, for prices to fall, because unemployment was sky high. It was in the 25-30%. But prices of labour weren't even coming down. Prices were not coming down. And the prices of everything would need to come down for the economy to re-engage onto the right track. That wasn't happening. And partly because if you've employed somebody, it's not easy to renegotiate the wage contract, because you've got a contract written, say, for this is your pay. Menu costs, another thing, menu costs. So repricing everything is costly. You've got lease on buildings, and it's not easy to renegotiate all those terms and conditions. So it's not easy to bring prices down. And that was one of the key things that Keynes picked up on. And he said, because of the stickiness of prices, markets do not self-correct, they do not self-adjust. So therefore, it will take too long to allow the market to self-correct. So therefore, the government needs to do something. The government cannot sit by the side. It has to actually have an active role. And what active role was foreseen by Keynes was the government should spend. It should spend because nobody else is spending in the economy. Companies are not hiring and spending. Consumers aren't spending. Nobody's buying our exports because this is a global phenomenon, the Great Depression. So therefore, the only party left to boost demand is the government. Even though the government hasn't got any money, it can deficit spend and pay for the deficit later on when things pick up. So the government should start to undertake, big works projects, building dams, as FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, the 3.5-term president in the US from 1930, I think, till about 1944. He started to undertake massive works projects to start to re-engage all the idle labour capacity. And also going into the Second World War, when there was a massive spending stimulus, that is argued by the Keynesians is what lifted the economy back out of recession and led to the boom of the 1950s. So the Keynesian remedy is you can't let the economy self-correct. It will just take too long. The government has to do something. And what it does is through two sort of broad levers that the government policy is built upon. So one is called fiscal policy, one is called monetary policy. Fiscal policy relates to taxation and spending. So the government can tax less in order to give you more in your pocket so that you go and spend, or it can actually do the spending itself, i.e. expansionary fiscal policy. Or, on the other hand, monetary policy is about lowering the interest rate so that you incentivize people to borrow money, and then with such borrowed money they go and spend. Has the same effect. It boosts demand, and that was the goal of government intervention as seen by the Keynesians, to correct the economy, because it would take too long if left to the market forces. So the contributors, John Maynard Keynes, as I mentioned, Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate from Princeton University, another contemporary name when it comes to Keynesianism, 1953. He's still alive. So that's really the assumptions of the Keynesian school and what sort of policy recommendations they advocate. Now that worked fine from about the 1930s, although it's quite contentious as to whether it was the government spending that actually lifted the American economy out of recession, because there's other books and studies which have shown that it wasn't so much the government spending that lifted the economy, because even J. Edgar Hoover, who was Roosevelt's predecessor, had done some of these projects before Roosevelt came along. They didn't really have any effect. It was what was called regime uncertainty, which had stifled the desire for businesses to invest, because they just didn't know what the government was going to do. And when you're in a situation of uncertainty, you don't want to hire people, you don't want to invest, because you don't know what the market's going to do. Just like when inflation is out of control, you can't plan anything, you can't plan your budgets, so you're going to shy away from investment unless you know inflation is proceeding at a steady 2%, which is what central banks target, 2%, 2.5% inflation, to give people the stability they need for them to then undertake their investments, or companies to hire people, and so on. So it was a lack of regime certainty, according to one theorist, and I forgot his name, but it's on my blog. If you read the post on stimulus or austerity, it's written there. He said it's because there was no certainty, that is what stifled the recovery. And it was only when the government won the war, there was now certainty, there's a fixed level playing field. That's what drove the investment back. It was nothing to do with the stimulus. Well, that's a contentious argument. I'm not going to settle that necessarily in today's discussion. But just so you know, like with the example of colonialism, there's no clear-cut answer on any of this stuff. It's all opinions. And as I was mentioning just before, there was an Italian economist by the name of Alfred Perito. I think Alfred was his first name, but Perito was certainly his surname. He said, all of this debate amongst economists is really just froth. Underneath, it's all people adopting positions based on the interest group that they follow. So it takes away from, a lot of this, the idea that, there's a genuine disagreement underneath. It's all froth. Deep down inside, the reality is quite simple. The reality of economics is not as complicated as they make out. But as I said, it's useful to know some of the background, some of the terminology, because if we're engaging as dawah carriers in the field of Islamic economics, you need to pitch the argument using terminologies which people understand. That's what the debate is currently, the frame of reference for the current debate. We need to be au fait with those terms, and that's why I think it's beneficial still to go through some of these schools of thought. The next and last key turning point I'm going to discuss is monetarism. And the key name, Edmund Phelps and Milton Friedman. By far, Milton Friedman is the most famous monetarist, household name in the 1970s. He lived from 1913 till 2006. And another, Edmund Phelps, he's, I think, still alive. And Robert Lucas was another contributor to this whole revolution, monetarism / rational expectations. So what's the context, and why was there a need to abolish Keynesianism? What happened to Keynesianism that its shelf life finished after 40 years of successful implementation? Up until the demise of Keynesianism, there was a phenomenon called the Phillips curve. William Phillips, he was a New Zealand-born economist. He did some studies in the 1950s and 40s, I believe, in which he noticed there was this relationship between two economic variables, one of which was inflation, one of which was unemployment. And what he found is there was an inverse relationship in all the data that he studied. So as unemployment would go up, inflation would come down. So if you wanted to bring down unemployment, you would do it at the cost of some inflation. Now the problem is, there's 4 macroeconomic objectives of government, 2 of which are mutually exclusive: inflation and unemployment. So there was always a trade-off that was going on during the 40s, 50s, 60s. But in the 1970s, this trade-off broke down. It broke apart because both unemployment and inflation started to rise at the same time. And this was called by a British politician stagflation. Because you had stagnation on the one hand, i.e. with rising unemployment, and you had inflation at the same time. Not seen before. Everyone was confused. Nobody could understand it. The Keynesians were running for cover. They couldn't explain it. The savior was Milton Friedman. And what he did is he explained in a very scientific way. He won the Nobel Prize as a result of this work. Is what he did. He analysed this very closely, and he started to explain this phenomenon in great detail, and it impressed everybody. It impressed everybody so much. On the one hand, he said, look, why are you artificially trying to reduce unemployment? He brought this concept called the natural rate of unemployment. The unemployment will always settle to its natural rate. Roughly 4 or 5% of people will always be unemployed. So forget about this full employment policy. And that's because you'll always have some unemployment. You'll have seasonal unemployment, lifeguards, they're not going to have jobs maybe, in the winter. Frictional unemployment, when you're between jobs. Cyclical unemployment, which is unemployment as a result of the boom and bust cycle. And structural unemployment, where, your industry has just died, like textile industry died up north, and those people are long-term structurally unemployed. So you'll always have some degree of unemployment. He said, look, the government shouldn't worry about unemployment. Leave it. Let it settle. All it should do is to worry about inflation. And he said in his famous words, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So his argument was quite revolutionary. What he said is when you've got too much money in the system relative to the goods and services, then you will always have monetary inflation. And that is what you need to do. To control inflation, you need to soak out the money supply. And the way traditionally that's done is by stoking up interest rates. So that it's like a sponge, it soaks up the excess money and it brings the money supply down, and the prices of the 1970s, which was just skyrocketing, started to come down off the back of his policy recommendation. So he's the new king of economics, Milton Friedman. And one of the things he used, and I'll just touch on this very briefly, is now you may think, why did the traditional government strategy of increasing the money supply, increasing demand through government spending, which has an effect on increasing prices, why did that stop working in the 1970s? Was there some kind of, did people change? What happened? The key turning points were obviously the end of the gold standard, it wasn't exactly a gold standard, but from 1944's Bretton Woods agreement in America until Nixon abolished the gold standard peg, where all the currencies of the world countries had pegged their currencies with the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at the rate of $35 per troy ounce of gold from the 1944 agreement at Bretton Woods. That system was abolished in 1971. So then suddenly, and then the Smithsonian Agreement, 1973, everyone abolished the peg to the dollar. And so currencies became purely fiat, i.e. paper currencies, not backed by anything. Because prior to that point, there was a peg to gold. So you could take your currency, convert it to dollars, present the dollar to the Federal Reserve, and you'd get your gold. But the Americans started to deplete the gold base behind the system until the point, triggers like the Vietnam War, they just needed more money than they were allowed to produce according to this agreement. Unilaterally, as typical American style, unilateralism, abolished the peg. I said, sorry, from now on, we're not honouring this link to gold. It's a fiat currency. We recommend you do the same. Yeah, compare that to when Mexico in 82 said, I can't pay my debts. Unilaterally it could have said that. The way America did more of a theft of global theft. But suddenly it's no structural adjustment. We'll give you more time. Borrow more money and we'll roll over your debt. But when America wants to unilaterally abolish the gold standard, and countries by this time have built up such hard currency reserves in the form of the dollar, which is now worthless. So anyway, this led to exponential growth in the money supply, which is one of the triggers for the inflation. Because people started to catch on to the idea that prices are going up. There's too much money. So the effect of the government is now ineffective because people will just say, I expect inflation, I want more wages. So the wages were going up and up. And that's why people weren't working, because nobody could afford to hire people at that higher wage. And people were withdrawing their labour because they weren't getting the wage that they wanted. So unemployment was not affected anymore. So that was the key point which made the stagflation a reality in the 1970s, and which led to the demise of the Keynesian way of looking at the world. And the terminology is called rational expectations, because within economies there's been various iterations in the view of people's expectations. So before you had this idea of static expectations, which was people only taking into account the reality around them, the current reality. And then you had adaptive expectations, which is people take into account the reality around them and the recent past to formulate their expectations of the future. And then you had rational expectations, where people take into account everything, even the future. They factor everything in and they wise up to what the government's doing, which renders the government's policy initiatives ineffective. And that's why we had the stagflation of the 1970s. So that's like a sort of return to what was before the Keynesian school, which is the classical school, albeit with a bit of a more sophisticated view about the money supply. So that's really where monetarism fits into the timeline. So that's really that sort of brings us to the 1980s. There's been some variants since then. Very recent variant is behavioral economics, and I'm not going to really touch on this. I'm wary of time, and it's probably divergent slightly. But behavioral economics looks at psychological insights to model consumer preferences, and so they talk about things like anchoring and social belonging. So, for example, they did a study where they asked a group of students if they could just read out the last 2 digits of their national insurance number. And then after that, they showed a product and said, what do you think this product is worth? And they found that the people the last 2 digits on their national insurance number was quite high, tended to pick a figure which was quite high as well when it came to ascribing a price for this particular commodity. So psychologically, they want to analyze these type of phenomena. And what they say is people anchor onto a value. And because they've anchored onto this value, they're much more likely to bring another figure which is close to this value. So as a practical example, one of the lecturers that I was viewing, he said he walked into a shop and he wanted to buy a tool, and the shopkeeper says, oh, this electric drill is £200. And then the speaker said, I was taken aback by that. And then after a minute he said, oh no, sorry, I made a mistake, it's £100. He thought, bargain, because he'd anchored onto 200. So when he was told it was 100, because he'd anchored his mind onto the larger figure, the smaller figure looked very attractive. Just like the concept when you go to a sale and you see a jacket from £300 down to £70, you think, bargain, because you've anchored onto the higher figure, and so the lower figure seems like a bargain. Whereas if you just walked in and it said £70, you're far less likely to buy it. So behavioral economics is not really bringing anything at the policy macroeconomic level, but it's just giving new insights into the way people work and how to extract economic benefit from that in terms of markets and also government. So, for example, if you're supposed to fill a questionnaire out and the government sends a census to everybody, it finds through insights derived from behavioral economics and psychology is if it says you haven't filled in your form yet, it's far less likely to get the person to fill the form in compared to if it says you're one of the few people in your street that haven't filled out the form. Because then you feel this a sense of social ostracization. I'm an outcast, I'm one of the few, and then you're much more likely to fill in the form. Even more likely than, the threat of penalties or just being told you should fill out the form. And those insights come from behavioral economics. Then we talked about Keynesianism and neoclassical, then you've got new Keynesianism and new neoclassical, which are just those schools reinvented around the concept of rational expectations. So again, nothing fundamentally different, it's just those schools reinterpreting themselves around this insight brought by Milton Friedman and Robert Lucas as far as the rational expectations. Then you've got, and coming to a close now, Austrian school. They very right-wing, very much classical, but they go even further to the right. So they believe in gold standard. They disagree with the concept of central banks, but still very, very much free market orientated. And some of the notables, as I mentioned, Karl Menger, 1840 to 1921, Murray Rothbard, 1926 to 1995, Ludwig von Mises, 1881 to 1973, Friedrich Hayek, 1899 to 1992, and there's some more contemporary Austrian, even Ron Paul, the presidential candidate in America, Peter Schiff, Tom. I forget his name, but anyway, some of the notable. So it's considered a fringe school, but nonetheless, if it can get a presidential hopeful, then it obviously can't be so fringe. And then sort of to conclude, you've got Reaganomics, which is a bit of a hybrid. So you're not always going to get just this president is just a monetarist. He's Keynesian. You can have a hybrid. And Reagan was an example of a hybrid. So he believed in monetarism, but on the military spending front, he was very much Keynesianist. So he's been called military Keynesianism, monetarist, and what is called supply side. Now, supply side economics is the idea that if you reduce the tax for the highest earners down to nothing. So when Reagan came in from Carter, the highest tax bracket was something like 70-80%. He dropped it down to almost nothing. And the argument is one of trickle down, i.e. if we make the highest levels of society affluent and wealthy and incentivize them to innovate, to produce, then this wealth will trickle down to all levels of society. So that's the justification that Reagan used to cut the tax on the highest earners. Because the idea is you create wealth at the top and it trickles down. And this Arthur Laffer was the person who modelled this idea of the trickle down, reducing taxes for the top, and his work is often referred to as the Laffer curve, which is supposed to show how this happened. It didn't actually happen in reality, but that was a theory. And Ronald Reagan himself, who was the political manifestation of that theory. Finally, you've got very much what is blamed on the current mortgage-backed derivatives blow-up, neoliberalism, which sort of came off the back of the end of Reaganism, where it's all about open your trade, globalization, removal of tariffs, removal of subsidies, open trade, no import-export barriers, privatize everything, liberalize the financial sector, get the regulation out, all the regulation which had historically been there to safeguard against, banks doing, retail banks doing what investment banks do, get rid of those regulations. So one of the key regulations was the Financial Services Modernization Act at the end of Clinton's era, also known as the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999, which basically it removed that wall between retail banking and investment banking, which is what enabled, retail banks to get involved with the mortgage-backed securities, which led to the blow-up of 2008, which is really... So neoliberalism took a slap off the back of that episode, which we're still going through. And then we've seen a return, certainly in countries like the US, to the Keynesian sort of view of pick the economy back through big spending and, bailing out the banks. So that's sort of where we have got to the modern... so within an hour, we've covered about 1,000 years of hopefully picking off the key points, the turning points, the key assumptions that led to, the modern economic system that we have. Jazakallah.